What's up, everybody? One Fun Guy podcast going live. I just came on, guys, a little bit early. I'm supposed to be doing the pod call tonight with Kelly. I sent him a message. I don't know if he's going to come on. He might be busy, so I thought I just wanted to give you some updates of what's going on with me. I am still doing my podcast, the One Fun Guy podcast. I did talk to a really cool band. I have to thank Athena. She is Athena, warrior queen on here. If you guys aren't familiar with her, Sass, what's up? Athena hooked me up with a band called the 500. We were talking about them on my podcast. So I reached out to them. They're super cool guys. And what they did was they sent me an album and they autographed it for me. And I really want these guys to be on my podcast. If you aren't familiar with the 500, they are they're obviously heavy metal, but they're more soulful, kind of got a Killswitch Engage vibe with them. Very powerful, very heavy, very awesome. And they are really just incredible people as well as they are musicians. So I am trying like heck to get them on. They have the Bloodstock Festival coming up. They're doing a bunch of other stuff, but I'm really excited to like get to know those guys and like explore their music. I really recommend the 500 on Apple, Spotify. They're on every major streaming platform. But just super cool people. I'm stoked that I know them. And they're just really cool. They sent me the album autograph, so thank you to the 500. I tagged them pretty much in all the videos. I tagged them everything with Athena. But I really have to give props to Athena. She hooked me up big time with those guys. So awesome. And that's what I wanted to bring it back to before I go on with Kelly, guys, is that this thing that we do here with social media is all about networking, right? It's getting to know people. It's getting to know their friends and their connections, just like you do with business, guys, right? If you're in a business and you're networking for sales or you're networking for products, it's the same concept. I just do it for a podcast, guys. So with me, excuse me, my podcast is my business. I don't sell anything on TikTok, guys. I sell myself. If you guys like my podcast, I linked it in the bio, One Fun Guy Podcast. If you can subscribe on YouTube, that's awesome. That's basically, guys, what I do. Honestly, I'm selling myself. If you guys like the podcast and you like watching me and you like me and Kelly and us hanging out, that's what this is all about. Sass, thank you so much for this. But this is really what it's about for me, guys. My podcast is pretty much what I am able to do for you guys. I don't sell any products. I don't come on and ask you guys to, send me gifts and tap the screen and touch my nose. If you guys send me gifts, I really appreciate it, but I'm not requiring you guys to do that. You don't have to send gifts to hang out with me. You don't really have to do anything but just be here. Share the show. It really helps me out. Like the show. It really helps me out. The quicker I get to 1,000, the quicker it hits the FYP. But for me, guys, all I'm selling is me and my podcast. It doesn't cost anything to watch me. It doesn't cost anything to do anything but your time, right? If you can go to subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Fun Guy Podcast, that's awesome. That helps me out more than you could ever possibly imagine. That's the big thing for me, guys. So really, all I'm doing is just trying to, make it in the world of podcasting, have a good time, chat with some people, make some friends, network a little bit, and get myself out there. If you want to be a guest on my podcast or somebody who you think would make a good guest, send them my way, guys. Please shoot me a message. I'm all ears. It's how I've met people. It's how I've networked. It's how I've grown. It's how I've done everything. Ducky, thank you so much. It's my podcast is me, guys. It's just what I do. It has no bearing on you being anything else but a friend to me and a supporter of my channel and helping me grow my podcast. That's what I'm about. I want YouTube to be my home. where I get all my followers on here to subscribe to my channel. That's what I want to do, guys. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Deandra, thank you so much. Olga, thank you for everything. Welcome, guys. If you're new to me or you're new to my channel, I'm the One Fun Guy podcast. I do a bi-weekly podcast on YouTube, guys. So really, for me, all I ask you guys is if you can support me, support my podcast. You know, I really am trying to make, you know, my podcast grow and expand my channel. It's all about growth. It's all about networking. It's all about doing everything. Haley, what's going on? Ellie, what's up? So for you guys, all I'm asking for is that you guys invest in me, right? All I'm asking for is for you guys to basically be there and support my channel. That's it. Those of you who know me, and I do this, guys. I've been doing it for a year now. Obviously, I want to keep growing and keep getting better, putting out better product, putting out better guests. Like I said, Athena hooked me up with the 500. Some of you guys have known about them. I'll say it now. I said it at the top of the podcast. This is their album. They sent it to me, guys. I reached out to them. They're super cool. They all autographed it for me. But if it wasn't for Athena, I wouldn't have been hooked up with those guys. So that's pretty much all I'm putting out there, is that's where I'm at with this, and what I'm trying to do for my podcast is just grow it and kind of keep going with it. So with that being said, guys, I just want to thank everybody who's here. You guys are awesome. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for doing all the things that you need to do to help me out. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm glad you guys are all here. Kelly, you're here. Hold on one second. Let me get you on here. Let me do this real quick. Ellie, thank you for liking the show. I invited Kelly. If you guys are new here, guys, just say hi, welcome, join us. Do all the stuff. We're having fun tonight, guys. I know it's draft night. So for all you football fans out there, you know that the draft is in Green Bay. So kudos to you guys for watching that. If that's your thing, awesome. I love football, but obviously my podcast is more important than the draft. So I'm here with you guys. I'm here for you. I don't know if I can share this out anymore. I'm going to definitely try. But guys, thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for doing the stuff that we have asked you guys to do, which is basically watch us, be entertained by us. Thank you for all the gifts. Thank you for all the love and support. And this is my other half, Kelly. So we are the Pod Cult. We're doing this now. Sandra, what's going on? If you guys are new here, say hi, follow me. I'll follow you back. And we'll get started tonight, guys.
I'm so sorry that I did not realize that there was a draft night, and I know you're a football guy. So
no, it's all good.
We can keep it short if you want to, but I know it usually starts at the top, right? It's not one of those.
So the Tennessee Titans had the first pick. It basically everybody in the draft. I have Fox, ESPN, and the Sports Network. So basically everything that pops up tells me who drafted what. So I'm getting all the highlights. This is no big deal. It'll come out, so where we're at. So we're all good.
Yeah, no, I actually did saw something about that when I was at the gym this morning, but I didn't connect to the fact that you're into it. So I'm sorry.
No.
But it did get my mind back to I think for the Super Bowl I was thinking about, like, how about we change some names of the of the teams just to make fun of it,
right?
So Green Bay, obviously, it's Green Day, so it's like the Green Bay American Idiots, maybe, or the Green Bay Dookies, Tampa Bay Morbid Angels.
Yeah.
I don't know. San Francisco Thrashers. I don't know. The Bears are they still doing absolutely horribly, and
Yes. They
there's
have
no light at the end of the tunnel there.
they have the 10th overall pick. I don't know what they're going to do.
And
There's
that's
quite a few options that they have. The Bears historically have always picked horribly. Their draft picks never work out. It's just been a mess. They're just a poorly run organization. That's why I don't really support them anymore. And I've obviously been a diehard Bear fan since I was a kid. And after last season, I just said they're not worth my money anymore. I love the idea of like California teams, right? When their teams aren't doing well, their fans don't support them. Chicago, we're idiots. We support our teams whether they're good or bad. We support them win or lose. We give them all our money. We always watch them. We always fill the stadiums. We always buy their merchandise. And my question is why, right? If you buy, so I look at sports like I look at a product, right? If you buy a product and it's failed you over and over and over again, are you going to continue to buy that product? Are you going to go to a different product? And unfortunately, Chicago fans, we're stupid. We are very dumb when it comes to our sports teams. We are passionate. We are loyal. We are diehard. But we shouldn't be. When our teams stink, we should stop watching them and send a message to the owners saying, if you don't do what's best for your fans, we're not going to be here for you. Again, it's our kind of our detrimental downfall in the sports world because when other cities' teams don't do well, their fans don't go. That's why Oakland is moving to Vegas. People stopped going to Oakland because their team was absolutely horrible. Their ticket sales were down like 85% their last season. They went from having a 60,000 seat stadium, there were like 10,000 people watching the game. They couldn't fill the seats. So Oakland said, you know what, we're going to pack up and we're going to move. We'll sell the team to Vegas. We'll recoup some of our loss and we'll go from there. That's how the Cubs should have been for the last 100 years before 2016. People should have stopped going to the games and stopped watching them. You know, we were deemed the lovable losers, right? You cheered for a losing team. And Wrigley Field sells out 50,000 seats every game. It's the world's largest bar. They don't care what's on the field. Chicago fans want the experience. Same with the White Sox. They've been awful. 2005, they got lucky and they won the World Series. I've been a Sox fan for most of my life, and they put bad product on the field and people still go. The Bulls, they haven't been good since Jordan. I think they made the playoffs like 3 times since the 98 Bulls. People still go to the Chicago Stadium all the time. We got lucky with the Blackhawks, right? They had some good runs, the 2010, 2013, and 2015 Stanley Cups, right? They won 3 in 5 years. That's pretty epic. That's a good win. But since 2016, they've been crap for basically 9 years, but people still go to the games. So when Chicago fans stop supporting the teams, so I kind of took my own stand, right? I kind of just went to the thing where I'm not going to support the Bears anymore. They're absolutely terrible. They refuse to do good. They refuse to pick good people. They refuse to buy players. They refuse to move the stadium. They refuse to put a dome up. They refuse to be fan friendly. So if you're doing all of that and you're refusing, then I'm refusing to be a part of your organization. So I boycotted the Bears. So I don't care what they do.
Fair enough. I feel like there's a sports chat coming on more than music today.
No,
Totally
I'm
fine.
done. I'm done.
No. Because I'm totally cool with that. Because I actually based pretty much on the same arguments. I just left sports in general, and I grew up being into sports so much, right? I played football or soccer since I was 4. And did diving and, took all kinds of sports.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was into martial arts, judo,
Yeah.
I was huge into sports, and I played hockey when I went to Canada, and I watched for years and years and years. It was one of the best things of moving to Canada was that I could watch NHL hockey at a human hour, because I watched them still in Sweden, but they started at 1 a.m. in the morning or something like that, right?
Right.
Because of time difference. So, that was great. And I watched every Maple Leafs game. I was a huge Maple Leafs fan because of Matt Sundin, my favorite player of all time. It was great. But then you start to realize, especially with the European perspective, you start to realize that what is it that your loyalty is for, right? It is that, yes, they play in your city,
Right.
but they have nothing to do with your city, really. Like it's, the owner is probably not living in your city. It's some investor,
Right.
somewhere else. And all the players, you're lucky if you have a hometown guy on your team. And then even like, especially in the NHL, I wasn't that much into football.
Hmm.
Although I mean I enjoy watching football. I love a good game of football, but
Sure.
it's like every year for a hockey team, about a third of the team changed. Like they
Right.
traded off like a third of the team.
Yeah.
And so it's like you had no time to get attached to people. It's like one or two stars that were sort of franchise players,
Hmm.
and that's it. And it's like what is it really that I'm attached to here? Am I attached to the city? Yes, I am. Like this is where I live, or this is the team that's closest to me. So yeah, but what do they have to do with Toronto or Chicago or
Right.
whatever, right? A paycheck.
That's it.
I just got so disillusioned with the whole commerce of it, and the fact that um, the team loyalty, the team loyalty, uh, could disappear just because of the commerce. Right? It's because you could be traded. It's like, yeah, I'm only making $12 million a year here in Toronto, but somebody else is offering me 14. So obviously, I could use $2 more million a year,
Sure.
you know, from 12 to 14. Obviously, that's a great choice. So I'm just gonna ditch my team and go with that. Or it's a team that says, hey, the other team is giving us lots of money, so we don't give a shit about a personnel that's been playing with us for a few years and have whatever, right? It stopped being about the sports for me. It stopped being about the
Right.
fans supporting. And to give you some perspective too, like the in Toronto, it's the same thing as here, and I think that's the main thing in like when you have like the huge metro areas. Um, Indianapolis is smaller, right? So they probably have a little bit more of a tight knit community because it's not the size of Chicago. I
Hmm.
mean, Indiana is still a big city or whatever, right? But it's like you know that whatever team that Chicago or New York or San Francisco or Toronto put in their arena, they're still gonna pack the stadium. It's
Yeah. I
it's still
mean,
gonna happen.
right.
Oakland,
And
Oakland, I get it's a little bit different because they had such a sucky team in such a high ticket price area. Like like it, real estate in the Bay Area is so expensive. They have to charge an arm and a leg, but at the end of it, like nobody
yeah.
wanted to pay that much money to constantly see a losing team, right?
So one of my best friends, Rich, he lives in Detroit, and last year he sent me some swag from Detroit. And he was like, listen, he's like, I know the because I told him how frustrated I was with Chicago. And he's like, well, we're gonna adopt you and we're gonna make you a Lions fan. And I said, awesome. But I like the way that these organizations run their teams, right? When Detroit was bad and their fans were booing them and people weren't going to the games and they weren't going to the Metrodome and they weren't going to the stadium, they pivoted, right? They said, what can we do to make this more entertaining for our fans? And they went and they bought good players and they got a new coach. And, they got Dan Campbell, who's like the guy. The Bears just take what they can get, and they always have done that. They've been a crappy organization, and they don't put money into the players. They always take the cheaper out. They always try to cut a corner here and there, and it shows. Excuse me. And so with the Bears, my issue with them has been they understand their market. They're not stupid, right? They're business people. We have a very, very strong market in Chicago, right? We're very, very loyal. still to this day, I want to say that Brian Urlacher's jersey is still like the number 3 or 4 selling best jersey in the NFL. The guy's been retired for a decade, right? His jersey still sells. It's amazing that, like, that's how loyal Bears fans are, right? And we look at it from a standpoint of a economic position where they say, listen, we can put a mediocre team. Our operating budget could be 75 or 80 million dollars when most other teams' operating budgets are between 250 and 300 million. So they're at the lower 1/4% because they know we're still going to go to the games and watch the team, whether they're good or bad. So if you're a Bears owner and you're in their upper management, you don't have to put the best team on the field. You could put the average team on the field and we're still going to go. And they know that. Where other markets, the Steelers, Pittsburgh is a great example, right? The San Diego Chargers is a great example, right? Those are markets where if they don't put the best teams on the field, their fans aren't going to go. They're just not going to show up. And they're very smart fans. Chicago, we're very dumb fans. We are very, very dumb fans. We're like zombies, right? Here's our money. You just keep taking it. We're just going to go status quo. And so I decided personally I was going to stop that cycle. And I said the Bears are not going to get another dollar of my money until they put a quality team on the field, which is going to be a very long time.
I'm a bit of an outsider guy, right? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a side perspective here, right? Chicagoans like to be angry.
I get it.
So I think that, for some people, they still go to the game because they want to get pissed off, and they'll relish in the fact that they can sit there and scream at the fucking team that's on the fucking field, and then they can have a party with or after party with people afterwards and just complain about how sucky they are. It still becomes a conversation. So it still is value in that. While with in San Diego or whatever, right? They just I don't give a shit. In Chicago they give a shit, I guess. Good or bad. And bad is almost sometimes better, in a sense. I don't know. You never get disappointed when you expect to lose.
Right. And it's funny because again, like we talked about this a few weeks ago, moving into music a little bit, but like Chicago is such a strong market for arts, in sports, in food, and we're big, but our music scene is rough, right? Like not a lot of bands come from Chicago, or artists that grew up in the Chicagoland area move to whatever city they make it big in and they claim that city. It's very unique. It's a very unique town because we are heavily indebted in music, right? We grew up with the blues and bluegrass. That's where our roots are in Chicago, right? And it just seems that like over the decades, there really hasn't been much to come out of the Chicagoland area. I want to say, obviously you have the Smashing Pumpkins and you have, a couple bands have made their roots in Chicago, but they're not from Chicago, like i.e. Pearl Jam, right? Like Eddie Vedder lives in Chicago and he's a Chicagoan, but he's not from Chicago, right? The Tom Morello grew up in Hoffman Estates, right? He went to Hollywood and joined Rage Against the Machine and says that, Rage is a Hollywood band. They don't claim Chicago, even though Tom grew up here, right? Obviously, one of your favorite bands, Ministry, right? Al Jorgensen, been a Chicago guy for decades, right? He's always claimed Chicago is his home, and he always says Ministry's from Chicago, which is awesome, right? Like to claim them, but I mean the reality of the fact is that like born and bred Chicago-based bands are few and far between. And one that I comes to mind, obviously besides Disturbed, obviously I think they're the biggest in the hard rock and heavy metal, is Pelican. They're a Chicago.
I've never even heard of them.
They are awesome. They are kind of like, the band ISIS? Have you heard of ISIS?
I've heard of ISIS. Yeah.
Okay, they're very similar to ISIS. They kind of got that stoner, doom, sludge rock, but they kind of put a little bit of a groove to it. So they kind of found their own thing. But Pelican is probably in the underground scene, like one of the more iconic Chicago bands, right? We've always had our, our Cheap Tricks, that's kind of the big one, right? And Enough's Enough, right? They were from Chicago, right? The 80s band. They always claimed, that they were here. And, but like when you look at the history of music and you look at all these artists that have played in Chicago, we are very bad when it comes to having like homegrown bands. Now there's a few. Obviously Flesh Grind was one of them, right? Rich grew up in the Chicagoland area. His band made it pretty big in the underground death metal scene. Flesh Grind had their big Live in Germany was like their big album that kind of put them over. But I mean, when it comes from like the scene though, we're really bad when it comes to that kind of stuff. We've had a few local death metal bands. We've had a few local rock bands. Obviously Bunker Hill. They used to play with Black Sabbath Ozzy all the time, and Zakk Wylde. When Black Label came through, Bunker Hill would open for him. But I mean, in terms of like other bands, I think Soil was the only other one that was claimed Chicago as their hometown, and they weren't even that great. So it's weird. It's a very interesting city, heavily into music in the scene, but not a lot of bands come from here, which is surprising. And I used the tie-in with the analogy of sports, but it's like, it kind of seems that they don't have to. We're just music fans, but we don't. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing some, right? I'm sure there's probably more people from the Chicagoland area that have made it big. But in terms of like bands that can actually say we were born and raised in Chicago and made it big and call Chicago their hometown, there aren't many.
Yeah, no, I think that most of the big names in the past, I guess 10, 20 years or whatever is more in the hip hop genre, which I'm not really in touch with, but
Sure.
I guess Chance is from here.
Yeah.
And there are those folks, right? There's a lot of like the South Side.
Yeah, you have, King Von, and you have I can't think of the other guy. He was the one that kept getting in trouble. He had a warrant out of Florida, and then he lived in Highland Park for a little bit in Lake Forest. He was a Chicago drill rapper. They have those kind of guys, but I mean, not, Little Dirk was from here. And I think there were a couple other ones too. I'm missing there, but yeah, the rap scene has been kind of big with Chicago and in the scene in with that kind of style of music. But in terms of anything else, I think blues is our bread and butter.
Yeah. No, and I mean, to some extent, I mean, I don't know if it's still true, but it used to be at least that, when you saw a place name on a record or a release or whatever, it's like, oh, fuck, they're from there. I gotta look it up. Like, I mean, the obvious example is like Seattle
Sure.
or San Francisco back in the thrash era, or Tampa Bay, Florida.
Yeah,
death
in
metal.
LA, right? The LA scene's always been just big with music.
Yeah.
I mean,
or punk rock from New York,
Sure.
or whatever, right? Like it is a little bit of a brand thing, right? Yeah, and Chicago, I mean, I've been to quite a few shows here with like smaller metal bands, and they're fucking awesome.
Yeah.
But I don't think that Chicago has a reputation of being a metal town. So
No, they
I
just
think
don't
that-
seem to make it, right? Like we hold big tours here, right? Every artist who's ever comes plays in Chicago, but as far as building a reputation here, we just seem to like, lackluster, like you mentioned, all those foremost cities, and then obviously the hardcore scene, right? With Boston and New Jersey, right? They kind of have their, their scene, and we kind of, and Cleveland has a big underground metal scene, right? And it's like they're a small
Ohio,
town, and they have huge bands, and then obviously Slipknot put Iowa on the map, right? No, Iowa wasn't ever really known for anything except when Slipknot came out, it was like they claimed Iowa, right? Axl Rose is from Lafayette, Indiana, right? He moved to L.A. and he is a small town farm kid, goes out west and makes it big, right? But L.A. claims Guns N' Roses, right? Guns N' Roses says they're from Los Angeles. They don't say we're from Iowa.
Yeah, no, but that's how it works in the States too. Like you move to where things are happening,
Sure.
right? You have to be associated with that scene.
Yeah.
I mean, Metallica went from LA to Bay Area,
Hmm.
or you know, everybody everybody moves to LA or Nashville or whatever, to depending on what it is that they want to do, right? And then there were dance acts that went to Miami because of the Miami bass thing happening there
Yeah.
in the EDM scene, and or if you wanted to be a punk rocker, you went to New York City, or if you wanted to be hardcore, you went to Washington D.C. Or whatever, right? So that happens all the time. It seems like in this country that you feel like you have to move to where the action is. And Chicago, in terms of the music that you and me are into, just doesn't have that. Um, but as things go, here's the positive part of it. I'm usually a glass half full type of guy.
Yeah, me too.
It's long overdue, right?
Sure.
And I haven't been here for very long, but there's a lot of really fucking creative people that are
Oh yeah, there's
really, really, really good.
right.
Like it's really, really good. So it's just a matter of it's a powder keg that needs to happen, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be something that blows up.
Now I
I've
will say,
I I talked to this guy, Liam Zero. Like he's got something called Legion Zero. That sounds
mhm,
absolutely awesome, industrial wise. Satanic Hispanic, Saint, other folks here that are doing kind of a black metal industrial hybrid thing.
yeah,
They just need to stop calling it witch house because it's not witch
right.
house. Okay,
Yeah,
like that's a dead genre. That just get rid of that shit.
yeah,
But I really do think that Chicago, and its tradition and reputation has been sort of cutting edge. I mean, obviously, that's where blues got into the mainstream or whatever, right?
right. Thanks,
Or the
Sass.
industrial. That's the industrial thing. I mean, Ministry called them Chicago or whatever. I I would still say that yes, Jorgensen was born in Cuba or whatever, right?
Right.
But he spent most of his time in Chicago. The whole Wax Tracks thing that happened, with Revco and
Yeah.
Thrill Kill Cult and all that stuff. So it's Chicago House for that matter, right?
Well, I was gonna say,
That
right,
whole thing.
our DJ
So
scene was very big in the late '90s and early 2000s. Chicago
well,
probably
even before then,
was,
yeah, the Chicago
yeah,
House scene,
like,
that was '80s. So
yeah. I was gonna say that in the '90s, especially, Chicago was probably home to most of the DJs that were playing shows before it was a thing to do, right? Chicago has been a very, very big scene in the DJ world, right? A lot of DJs from Chicago. Um, you had radio stations that would solely play dance music because of what Chicago was doing in our scene. So I was going to say that earlier that DJs from Chicago have been very, very predominant and have gone out to be worldwide DJs that started off in the club scene in Chicago. So we do have that, right? And we do have some stuff. But I think in terms of the in the hard rock and heavy metal scene, especially, you know, Chicago's always had this cult like scene, right? Where we've always had an underground scene, right?
Mhm.
When I was growing up, one of the biggest bars in the
Great
city,
punk scene.
yeah, was a bar called Neo. And Neo would play trance, they would play goth, they would play industrial, they would play. I mean, it was like an eclectic mix, but it was like that was the place for the kids who didn't like DJs and house music. They all went to Neo because that was the underground scene, and Neo was huge. Right, Neo was the place to be on the weekends. If you liked that kind of underground, kind of cult scene, right? You had a lot of people goth, a lot of people vampire, a lot of lace, and a lot of darkness, and a lot of it was cool, and that's where I fit in, right? Because when you went to a normal club, an above ground club, right? Neo, you actually walked through an alley and with a little neon sign, and you walk down a flight of stairs, and it was an underground, like it probably held 1,000 people, but it was completely, if you didn't know where it was, you'd never find it.
Yeah.
You know,
And I'm so with you on that. I think that it's part of the thing too of the mentality of the city is that I love this shit and I want to keep it to myself. Well, I
yeah.
mean that goes for most underground societies, right? Um, but I also think that so I think you're right. There's the underground lounge. There's Liars Club. There's Live Wire. There's shit. I forget, but
Yeah,
I've been
Lion's
to
Head's another one. Lionhead Pub was always that way.
and a bunch
Um,
of breweries are
yeah.
sort of metal oriented
Now
too.
I don't
Like
know if it's still there. You may
but
know. I don't know. But Delilah's was a punk metal bar. They were kind of really cool. Delilah's was a lot of fun. If
don't know.
you went on that, um, that was one of the big things. That was kind of the big issue, right? And then the other one was you had Delilah's and you had Exit, right? Exit Chicago was big. Exit used to have bondage night, right? You'd go on Thursday night and it would be, you'd go upstairs and it was all trance and stuff like that. And they would have girls, and whips and chains and all that kind of stuff. And people would go there and they'd sell their bondage equipment, right? People that sold leather whips and people that sold corsets and heels and fishnets and all this stuff. And they would basically have like a boutique and you would go upstairs and it would be all goth and trance music. And then you'd have a table where all these different vendors would sell all their, kind of exotic underground, stuff. And Exit was really, really cool. So Delilah's and Exit were like really fun because the Exit was really, really like unique because it was, you had bondage night on Thursday, you had gothic night on Wednesdays, you had heavy metal nights on Fridays, and then on Saturdays it was kind of like the downstairs was kind of like your normal like music, your like house music, but when you went upstairs it was metal, trance, it was a completely unique thing, and it was all these lights and lasers and smoke, and so Exit was really, really cool. Exit was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet. I've also heard of a bowling alley that was huge in the punk
Yeah,
or
so
ska scene.
it was I can't think of the name. So the bowling alley was on top, and then you
I
go
think it's
down.
kind of still there, kind of sort of,
Yeah,
but they're not doing the
um,
show thing anymore.
I can't think of the name of it. It's not Logan's.
I drove past it, and
Yeah, but
someone said,
underneath,
"You know who
un,
played there?" And I'm like,
yeah.
"What?"
So it was kind of like walking into a really bizarre world because you would have bowling on top, and underneath you'd have the most insane death metal bands playing on the bottom of it. It was unbelievable.
Yeah,
It was Piper's Alley.
that's not the name I remember, but oh yeah,
Yeah,
Pipers. Yeah, you might be right, Pipers. Maybe that's all it said
yeah.
right.
So above bowling, below any hardcore, heavy metal, death grind, you name it, they played there. It was actually really cool. It was a lot of fun. That was um cosmic
Yeah,
bowling with metal music. That's a good idea, right? It's a definitely an eclectic crowd, and you know what you're going to get. The only thing is that with metalheads and stuff like that, they tend to kind of gravitate towards each other, but they also tend to be more unique in that way that like they just like the scene, right? It's kind of weird, but it's like, metalheads are a unique group of people because like they obviously are drawn to the music, but I mean, I could see that being kind of cool, right? A bowling alley that plays heavy metal. I mean, the
yeah,
crowd you're going to get, right? You're not going to get, the the average person, right? You're going to get the more unique crowd. So I could be kind of cool, right?
yeah, yeah. I'll touch on that on a bit, and I want to get back to a bit of an opinion on Chicago, right?
Yeah.
I just want to go down memory lane a little bit, based on the bowling alley thing, and it was like in my hometown, 120,000 people or whatever, right? We put on shows that were in like youth clubs or whatever, right? That's or wherever. It could be like a church back garage or whatever, right? And whatever we could get a hold of, we could put on shows. And we were not of legal drinking age, so we didn't have to worry about a bar or people wanting to have a beer or whatever when we played. So that was cool. Then we got of age, and it and it was like we still want to put on shows.
Right.
And now we want to, be able to have a beer legally, or people having beers there legally. We ended up finding an Indian restaurant that had more space than customers. They had the upstairs restaurant where everybody was, but then there was a bar downstairs that was huge, and nobody ever went there, and they just called it their beer hall or whatever, right? But nobody was ever there. So we were like, we totally sold them on, hey, you guys have a really good space down there. All you need, and we can help you get that done.
Right.
It's a little bit of a podium to make it look like there's a stage, and we'll get bands in here twice a month, and these people like to fucking drink, and you know how much of a profit margin you get on beer or whatever, right? Yeah, so that happened, and then all of a sudden, this Indian restaurant became sort of the mecca of punk rock metal in the general area. I mean, because we were the largest city, past Stockholm or whatever, right? So it was a fun thing, but it was still weird. Like, you're going to play at Taj Mahal, the restaurant, they tried to call it like something like the club or Club Rock or something like that, just because they realized that Taj Mahal wasn't necessarily what would go with the metal scene, or punk rock or hardcore. But man, there were some good fucking shows being on there. But going back to the Chicago thing, and the underground thing in general, is that you're very protective, right? When you're part of the underground scene, it's like, this is mine. I don't want to get bigger than this. I enjoy what's going on here. I like to be one of 60 people sweating in this shitty bar, right? I love that shit. So don't get me wrong, like I love it. But it also makes it difficult for people to break out of that thing. And I also think that because of Chicago not having that much of a reputation, and I mean there are some bands that are saying that they're Chicago, and like Pixel Grip say so, and Bellhead are starting to get bigger, and so on, but people aren't yelling from the rooftops that they are Chicagoan. So whether it is that they want to keep the secret, or whether it is that they're trying to, but nobody's listening. But I really do think that there's so much good shit going on here right now. Granted, I haven't been very much in metro areas with 10 million people in it. But I still feel like there needs to be someone that comes in and discovers the scene, not just one band, right? They can always be the one band, like Disturbed or Ministry or whatever, right? But what served Chicago back when the Ministry thing happened was that Jorgensen had his fingers in so many other projects too. Like he had Revco or Thrill Kill Cult or all that stuff. He produced Skinny Puppy and all that stuff, right? So Chicago became a bit of a thing, in the early 90s industrial thing, with Nine Inch Nails and all that blowing up. So there was a brief Wax Trax moment there for Chicago. But I really do think that there's a powder keg. There's an armory waiting to explode. I think, and it's just needs to have the right fuse with the right person setting it off. And I really do think so. Might not be next year, might not be 5 years, but it's bound to happen, because there's a lot of exciting shit going on.
Yeah. So the Chicago scene, obviously I grew up in it, right? I've been born and bred my entire life in Chicago, right? The Chicago scene has always been one of word of mouth, right? If there's a band that people like, they say, hey, you got to check out this band. They're really awesome. They're playing at the Metro. They're playing at the Riv. They're playing wherever they're playing. And it's always kind of been that way. You know, you made reference to tape trading back in the day, you know, where you would trade a bunch of tapes. You know, when I was a kid, flyers were on corkboards, right? You'd walk down the street, downtown Chicago on Lake Street, and you'd look at it right now and you'd say, okay, who's playing the Crowbar tonight? Who's playing the Metro? Who's playing the Riv? Who's playing the Vic? And you would see all these band flyers. And
Is the Crowbar was that a bowling alley?
no, Crowbar was a bar, but they used to have a lot of punk and industrial bands playing there.
Okay,
And-
sorry, I just rang a bell.
Yeah, and so Crowbar, you know, the Metro was always for your mid-tier people. It's people that could sell more than 1,000 tickets, right? The Metro was kind of that. If you could get 100 people at your show, that was awesome. If you get 200 people, great. If you get 300 people, now you had to start moving up levels, right? The Metro was mid-tier. The Riviera, the Vic, those were your 2,500 to 5,000, right? That's kind of where you were at when you were in that range, right? More intimate, but still good. And a lot of it.
Both of those in the next month. I'm
Yeah,
going to
and
Riviera to see Ministry and Metro to see Melvin Snape on that.
yeah, so in there, the way that it is now, when you walk in the Metro, it's basically a time capsule, right? I don't think the Metro's changed in 25 years. You know, they've added better bathrooms, but that's about it, right?
I've been through the Halloween parties. They're fucking epic.
Yeah. So, but back in the day, it was not uncommon to go and get an Illinois Entertainer and leaf through it and say, okay, this band's playing here tonight. This band's playing here tonight. This band's playing. So you could get a couple options. Then as you started to build momentum, a lot of it was word of mouth. Hey, this band is really good. You should go and see them. Or this band is really good. You should go and see them. And that's kind of how the Chicago scene was. We didn't have the tape trading like the West Coast did or the East Coast did, right? We were more flyers. If you had a good artist or a friend who could draw and you drew a cool flyer and you had a cool logo, that's what people wanted to see. That was our tape trading, right? Everything in Chicago was always word of mouth. It was very, very low key. Now, when you went to a show, you'd have a guy standing at the door with a bag of CDs, right? Maybe 1 or 2 songs on a CD, and they'd hand them out to everybody at the show. Check out my band, check out my band, check out my band, check out my band. They would make stickers, right? Decals. They'd hand out decals. And they wanted you to get a decal because if you ever walked in any rock club in Chicago, they decal the bathrooms, right? So
still there, yeah.
So right. So decals were huge in the Chicago scene because when you walked into a bathroom, you wanted to see your band's decal on the wall, right? Now some of them would even go so far as to stick one in the urinal, right? To like you could get the most like racy spots you could think of to put your band's decal on it. So that was a big thing in Chicago, right? So we didn't necessarily have the tape trading. We had the CD sharing where it was very common for them to burn 1,000 CDs with 1 or 2 songs on it and give you those. But decals were a big thing and flyers were a big thing, right? Because flyers were everywhere. They were on bus stops, light posts. People would stick them in the newspaper thing, right? So you'd get 35 cents and you'd open up the Sun Times and you would stick your flyers in between the papers. So when somebody would pull it out, they would see your flyer in the paper. That's what they did. That was work, right? They worked to get their band recognized. But that was the big thing in Chicago, right? That was kind of how it was, but a lot of it was word of mouth. You got to check out this band. They're playing at the Riv. You got to check out this band. They played the Metro last week, and they're awesome. And that's kind of how it grew steam. And again, I say Pelican because that's kind of how people found out about them. They jumped on tour with a lot of bigger bands, and then they would float into Chicago and they would play themselves, and it was awesome. And you would have them play a 45 or 50-minute set before another band got on, and people after Pelican played would leave. They wouldn't even see the other band because they were awesome.
Yeah, but but I think that very thing is also what can frustrate bands a lot that have ambition, right? You know, we could look at Smashing Pumpkins that moved out of town, or you know, one of the best punk bands of all time, Dwarves. You know, they moved to San Francisco and ended up being on Sub Pop and stuff. There was nothing for them. There was no future for them in Chicago alone.
Sure.
Like
No,
Chicago
and that's true, right?
wasn't going to bring them anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem. Maybe it is that I mean, labels are disappearing. Whatever, right? But I don't feel like there's any hardcore media powerhouse in Chicago. I mean, other than Oprah, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but there's no huge media push, entertainment push in Chicago. I mean, obviously there are tons of TV shows,
Sure.
various emergency response teams in
Yeah.
Chicago. Or
Back in the
whatever.
day,
But
I
there's
remember Nightfall was probably the biggest Chicago record label for underground metal and hardcore music. They actually opened up a shop called Nightfall Records on Lawrence Avenue, and they had a recording studio called Nightfall, and they would take all these local metal bands and they would give them reduced studio prices for them to put out albums. But Nightfall was probably the biggest Chicago metal label. And again, that's in a different time, in a different era when actual labels mattered, right? So when you had Metal Blade and Metal Edge and Century Media and Prosthetic and all these other different labels from all these other towns, Nightfall was kind of the more out there band. And I remember Mortician was on Nightfall for a long time. They were loyal to Nightfall before they went to Century Media, and they went. But Nightfall put out Mortician's first album, which obviously, I always forget about Mortician too. They were Will Romer was a Chicago guy.
Yeah.
And
they
now Mortician, obviously, if you know the band, right? Will Romer played every instrument when they made the album, right? He was kind of like the one man band. He played the drums. He had a drum machine. He had the guitars and the bass, and he sang, right? He did the hardcore stuff. Thick Panda, what's up? But what was big about Mortician is that they were kind of the first band that I remember listening to where they would take clips from old horror movies and kind of intertwine them with the music. And they would
Right.
start out like every song with a line from Night of the Living Dead, or, I Spit on Your Grave, or, old Hollywood vampire movies. And they would always have a 2 to 20-second clip of a movie before they went into the blast beats, and Will Romer was just screaming his head off, with the growling death metal vocals, which I think Will Romer is probably one of the better heavy metal singers of all time. I know Chris Barnes, and Corpse Grinder kind of have their place in the metal scene, but I would put Will Romer up with any of those guys.
Yeah. I get the feeling that maybe the chance that Chicago has to break out of. I mean, it's so weird that a city of this size doesn't have more of contributions, right? Hearing the bands that I'm hearing, so but it almost feels like Chicagoans like to keep their secrets also. Like we can look at Steve Albini too, right? Like he was a guy. Obviously, he's from Evanston, had his money. He could have bragged and a bit and could have been like a bastard in other ways than what he was. But he kept pretty private, and sticking to his things the way things were. And I mean, obviously, Steve Albini was a mythical being, almost in a way, right? Like every '90s alternative person would have loved to have recorded at Steve Albini studio, and then afterwards, when he fell on hard times a little bit studio wise, I think it was more because like he seemed unobtainable in a way. It's like he's a unicorn. He doesn't really exist in a way. So it's like, man, there was a hesitance there, not realizing that Steve Albini actually still kept his prices very reasonable. Like because he was still a punk rock guy and he didn't want to overcharge anybody for anything. but it still feels a little bit like what you were saying. Like you have the secret spots, the clubs that doesn't even have a sign on it. It's just a black door, yeah, that you have to know where it is to
Right.
get in, and then
And
there's shit happening in there. So Chicago likes to keep its secrets.
sure,
So it's just maybe it's
and
just a
I
matter
will
of
say this
someone's
though,
cracking
right?
it open.
As much as they like to keep their secrets though, we didn't have that many secrets to keep. That's the thing about it, right? When you look at it from the standpoint of what they had and what they could do, right? Most of the Chicago bands that have been, in the Chicagoland area and that have done everything and that have kind of, they didn't really, there wasn't really that much notoriety there for somebody to call a record label and say, "Hey, listen, these guys have something here," right? Disturbed was like the big one, right? They kind of had that unique sound. David Draymond had that voice. They were Chicago guys. They made it big, right? But there weren't many bands like Disturbed. It seems like all the ones that were out just kind of hit that level and then they stopped. Disturbed was like
And
the
they
one
weren't
band that
representative of a scene either. Like
that's the thing, right?
they weren't the top of an iceberg where there was a lot of other bands in Chicago
Right.
that were doing the same thing.
So I think that really hurt Chicago because, like you said, yeah, we like to keep secrets, but we didn't have any good secrets to keep. There weren't that many good bands from Chicago, like where you could say, "Wow, these guys are really good." And the ones that were good got noticed, right? Like the ones that had notoriety, that got record deals, and that actually made it. They were the ones that were basically, you see them, right? Because all the other ones you never got a chance to see. You don't even know who they are. And
Yeah.
it's sad because there are a lot of good Chicago bands out there, but unfortunately the world never got to see them, right? The world got to see Disturbed, right? The world got to see the Smashing Pumpkins, right? The world got to see, arguably Ministry, right? If you're going to call them from Chicago, right? But the reality is like they're all those other bands that were from Chicago, all the last 100 we probably just named, the only people that got to see them were Chicago locals. They never made it to get to that level, right? And that's kind of been my, issue with a lot of the bands from Chicago is the fact that, they don't really have these these big name notoriety bands that are out there, because it's like you look at it from the standpoint of the ideology of the bands from Chicago that you've seen have made it, right? And that's a small list. Where like you forementioned New York and Miami and Tampa and all three spots in California, right? From Sacramento to the Bay Area to LA, right? Those bands that came out of those areas, you know who they are. They're world famous, and there's several hundred of them, right? New York, you look at all the punk bands that came out of New York. We could name probably 20 right off the top of our heads. That was a scene. But they made it from that area. When you look at Chicago bands and you're like, okay, name me 10 Chicago bands. I think I can name 3 or 4, 5 maybe.
I think you're definitely onto something because, when we're talking about the New York sound or the Florida sound or the Bay Area sound or whatever, it was definitely a sound that when you heard it you said, it sounds like it's from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's probably what's missing. Like there are tons of really good bands, but there's no sort of cohesive, what is the Chicago sound? I don't think, I didn't realize that until you just brought that up. Really, like it's
Yeah, we don't have one,
there
unfortunately.
there isn't a sound that says Chicago. Like, they're great metal bands, that are great electronic EBM bands or whatever, right? Maybe I can contribute a little bit, right? Because
Right.
usually, when you get that sound of whatever city you live in, right? It means that you're creating something new that nobody's heard before. I'm For me, I want to create music that and I don't want to turn this into a self promotion
No,
thing,
do it
right?
because you're awesome.
But
Self-promote.
for my musical pleasure, my personal pleasure in creating music, I want to make music that doesn't sound like everything else, right?
Mhm.
And you know, I'm not saying that I will cause a chain reaction because I have, like 110 listeners on Spotify or
It doesn't
something.
matter, right?
My reach isn't exactly huge, let's put it that way. But the mindset still, right? It
Yeah.
is that, you know, um it's not necessarily to create a Chicago sound, but it's like, okay, there's a musical community here. A lot of bands know each other. And back in I keep going back to the Swedish thing in the early 90s. It was like the community was just that they were into the same thing and
Yeah.
kept pushing each other
And you had
towards something.
right.
And then people sort of were motivated by the other bands around them. And then what happened was, Scandinavian death metal, like by accident. It wasn't like a bunch of bands getting together in a room and had a meeting and said, what can we do to create the Scandinavian death metal sound? That's not what happened, right? It's just that you get a number of bands that are really good to challenge each other and push each other to not do just the traditional shit that sounds like everything else, and
So
that's
what
when you
would
get a signature sound.
okay, so we've established the fact that our Chicago history and music has been rooted in blues, right?
Yes.
And we could establish that between the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we had house music, right? That was kind of our thing. Fast
Just
forward to
foundation.
2025,
Yeah.
you want to make a Chicago sound in the metal scene. You have your sound. A couple of the bands you mentioned have their sound. What do you guys do to push that? Like, what is your idea from what we're saying right now, throwing it into the universe? Where do you see the sound going? And do you see that maybe you now have taken the reins upon yourself and a couple of the other bands that you mentioned to get that sound off the ground in Chicago and become world famous for that sound? Where does that start? In your mind.
Fearlessness, absolutely. It's it is the ability to letting the creativity flow, as in what is that you want to do, as opposed to what is it that you like to hear, type of thing. Like,
Sure.
where's the creativity going, and where has it never gone before, right? I think that's the key thing, right? And once you get, like I just said it before, once you get a group of really good bands together to be a fairly tight knit group or whatever, right? And they just push each other, and they get out of that mindset as in, oh, we want to be a great death metal band, so let's try to play death metal the way that the great death metal bands do, and just try to make it a little bit better, as opposed to, let's break the fucking mold of what death metal is. Like, I don't give a shit what death metal has been for 35 years. Like, I'm gonna play this fucking riff, and drummer, I don't give a shit what beat you play,
Right.
whatever, right? Let's just go with the gut instead of whatever the scene says, right?
So where do you so you establish, or you want to establish, this sound, right? This creativity that you have, right? Where do you see it going in the next 6 months to a year? Now, obviously, you said perseverance, hard work, determination, fearlessness, all these things, right? But with you starting out this sound now, right? You've released a song, so we kind of understand where you're at. You're releasing another one very soon. We understand where your mindset is at. You continue on with your projects, and you obviously have some friends in the music business, in the scene, that kind of have a sound as well. How do you feel you unite that to make that the new Chicago sound in your mind? Like, where do you see it? Like, how do you see that happening? Is there a strategic way that you're going about it, or are you just kind of living for you, doing what makes you happy, and you hope that the bandwagon starts growing?
Yeah, more the latter, to be
Okay.
honest. I don't feel I don't feel that I'm a CEO of any sort of people leader, that sort of thing. But what what I would like my music to show is that, fuck, like,
Right.
you can do something different and it can still sound appealing, like catchy or whatever, right? But still be something that is not quite what you've heard before. And I would love it if people thought that what I do is amazing, and that they would want to beat me,
Okay.
basically, right? Or get encouraged that, shit, this shit is really good. I see what he's trying to do.
Okay.
That's inspiring. I mean, like, we're dealing with artists here, right? You can't tell artists what to do generally, right? Artists need to be
No.
inspired
But I
and,
guess
and be
I guess where I'm going with
self-motivated.
this, and I kind of want to save this for next week because I think it's going to be a good topic that we start off with it. But you mentioned it before. We don't have a scene. How do we get one?
Yeah,
That's the thing, right? Like, that's because a scene means it's you, some friends of yours, some other artist, some hard work and dedication. You obviously have friends that write songs. You have friends that are in bands that play. They have a following. How do you get that scene in front of eyes? Because that's what it starts with, right? It's an eclectic group of musicians that play, and then more and more fans come and they like the sound, and then more and more fans come, and the next thing you know, you are now in the middle of this scene that I'm not saying you necessarily created, but you definitely have an impact.
yeah, and I mean, I'm not saying that that's an ambition of mine. It's not necessarily a goal of mine to create a Chicago scene, being just recently arrived or whatever, right? But it's not impossible.
Right.
I mean, we can look at Seattle, which we all know in retrospect, right?
Hmm.
And we can boil it down basically to two bands, and that's Green River and Melvins. And those two bands turned into Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Alice in Chains and
Hmm.
all these other bands. It was two bands really that in the mid '80s
Yeah.
planted the seed that 6 years later had blossomed into like something absolutely incredibly amazing. There, and it's not like, oh, we had these two bands and then
Right.
all of a sudden 6 years later there are a lot of people that are inspired by them. It's like, no, there were two bands that planted the seeds of that stuff
Sure.
that spawned. It's it's like the cell duplication type of thing. Like, you don't really notice when one cell duplicates into two, but once you square that over a period of time, then you have like a massive amount after a long time, which
Yeah.
has a massive effect. So, if by the time I'm 60 that I'm recognized as having
Right.
planted a seed somewhere in the seed and in the scene, and Chicago has turned into like the hub of most innovative
Right.
metal electronic
Sure.
hybrid innovation thing, then I'll be happy as a clam.
Nice.
But for now, I just do what I do,
Right.
trying to be happy doing
Sure.
it with a good attitude and trying to be
That's it.
inspiring to others or whatever, right? But I'm not a preacher. I'm not someone that I'm not Elon Musk. I don't want to take over the world or anything like that, right? But hopefully people will hear and see what I do and think that, fuck, that's a pretty good idea, and it doesn't
Right.
seem like it's that hard. So why don't we? Like, we've had a band for 6 7 years and we're still stuck in the bar scene. Like, what damage can it do
Right.
to try to be a little bit bolder?
I like it.
And so, but yes, it's a good topic. I haven't really thought about it, but yeah, we can say that for sure.
because I like the idea of it, because I obviously I see where your head's at, right? And I know you have creativity in there and you want to get it out. But when you look at, again, the scenes of cities that have established it, right? It wasn't one band that started it. It was an eclectic group of musicians that said, hey, listen, let's get this going. We'll see if we could do some shows, get some people in. And then it kind of just spiraled from there, right? And then the next thing you know, it blows up. And it kind of seems like we need that, right? Chicago needs that now more than ever.
Friendly competition. Let's try to outdo each other. Let's see how far we can take things. We just need to find the thing to take further,
right?
Which is not obvious. So it's just a matter of finding that core of what is that core that we should focus on and see what we can do with and push it as far as we possibly can. That's what happened in Scandinavia. That's what happened in Seattle. That's what happened in Tampa. That's what
Yeah, I mean, it goes all over. It's just I feel like that our scene could have been something great, and it seems like every time we have something, they just leave and they become popular, but they don't bring the other bands with them. Where a lot of the other bands that made it big said, "Hey, well, if you sign us, you got to sign our friends. You got to sign this band. You got to sign this band." And we're not going to sign the deal unless you sign these bands.
I realize that, and that I think that there might be an opportunity here too, because of that situation being so different now. Like, what if Chicago would become like the DIY hub, where it's like, we don't give a shit about any label. All of us are doing our own shit here, and we're getting out there. We are playing festivals, we are playing shows, we are touring, but we are not, label slaves. That might be a possibility, right? If Chicago gets to be like, if you want to be an indie musician and you want to do well, get the fuck over here.
Right.
I mean, if the bands that are here are dedicated to that thing and put in the fucking work, and get there, then it could be true. It could be true. Who knows?
Yeah. And I encourage you to check out Pelican. I dig those guys.
I will look up Pelican. All right, cool.
So let's wrap it up here. We'll see everybody next Thursday night. We're the Pod Cult. Check out all of Kelly's stuff, guys, under Arsenic. He's got a song coming out. He just released this song, which is awesome. So check it out, guys. I've tagged it in all the videos that I've done. So just look at my videos, follow Kelly, follow Arsenic, download his stuff. It's on every music streaming platform, guys. Look for Arsenic and download this song. It's awesome. Fire Entropy is an awesome song, guys. It is fantastic. And he deserves all the credit in the world, because it takes a lot to make a song and have it work and sound good. And he's accomplished that. So you got to give credit where credit's due. Kelly did a great job.
You're making me a little verklempt, and I'll just say that my cover of God of Thunder will be out Friday next week, so we'll have another one of these before then. But God of Thunder cover coming up.
Awesome. So guys, thank you again for all the love and support. We're gonna be on next week. We will talk more about the scene, the Chicago. Obviously, some people from here are part of the Midwest. I know Ellie's from Wisconsin. There's some of you guys that are on the West Coast. Some of you guys are on the East Coast. We just feel lonely without a scene here in Chicago. We talked earlier on in the episode about our sports teams. That's another topic entirely. But like, our music scene is just lackluster. And I think maybe we are going to try to hopefully change that now. So
let's do it.
We'll get the ball rolling.
There's no reason why not.
Right. So, all right, guys. Thank you again for the love and support. Follow Arsenic, like and follow Kelly. Do all the stuff you need to do. We'll see you guys next Thursday, and we will talk more music. Take care, everybody.